All right, we are ready to go. I'm not Pastor Mark. You guys probably have figured that out by now. They are in Disney, so lucky them. We got a little bit of warmth tomorrow, but we can be jealous tomorrow of them when it's 37 here. But we are going to continue in the study. Do I have to live stressed out? But a couple things before we do get started. We have, after tonight, we have 2 more of these studies, and then that'll take us to March 16th, where we'll have our spring cafe, and then we have a worship night, and then the 30th, we will end the month with a baptism. The cafe and the baptism, I have sign-ups up here for the baptism. If you want to get baptized, we've, between Ryan, myself, and Mark, we've heard from several people who are considering getting baptized. Sign up there, grab a book over here. And if you are a parent who has a child who is thinking about getting baptized, make sure that you see Ryan Moreno. He's got books that are geared specifically for our younger baptizees. Is that what? Yep. I got it. Ken Blythe's nod. It's baptizees. So grab Ryan. Make sure you get one of those books and walk through your child with that. And then come with your child, or if you're just getting baptized, then come yourself to the classes on Sunday the 13th and the 20th after the second service. And those just kind of talk about what baptism is, why we do baptism, the way that we do it, and then you get an opportunity in that smaller setting to kind of share your testimony that you will then share before the church at the baptism service. But if you aren't going to be a part of that by getting baptized, come out and support your brothers and sisters who are making that declaration in front of friends and family. Those nights are always some of the most powerful that we do to see very real right in front of us the work that God is doing in the lives of those who we see and maybe we don't know so well, but we get to see what God is doing in their lives. And then the cafe, which actually happens before that, that'll be on the 16th. Sign up for that. We need some talented or courageous people, or both, to be a part of that and to put on a show for us. If you want to sing, you want to dance, you want to juggle, you want to tell jokes, you want to do some combination of all of them, sign up for that. And then you can bring some food as well. We have like a dessert table over to the side that we kind of all just share that. So bring some of that with you as well. And that'll be a great opportunity for us to just get together as a family and to cheer one another on, enjoy some food, and have some fun. Last thing, this Sunday is our Youth Sunday. And I just want to encourage you all, or I don't know if I have the authority to command you, to be here for that, I know that when Mark's not here, sometimes feels like it's an excuse not to show up because he won't know that you're not here, or whatever goes on in your heads. I don't know what happens, but the numbers do go down, and let's not let that be the case for our Youth Sunday. I don't want to steal too much of what Dan will probably tell you on Sunday, but several of the teens came to him and were like, hey, we want to do this for Youth Sunday, where I've been the youth pastor. So I know that normally it's like pulling teeth or like telling them, you're doing this, you can do it. But he said they've been very enthusiastic about being a part of it. So come and support them. I think it will mean a lot to them to see that their church family supports them. And we'll get to see what God is doing in the lives of our teens, a very vital part of our church. So tonight we are continuing in our series, Do I Have to Live Stressed Out? And we're kind of in the middle of a point that we were looking at, and we actually will be this week and next week. We're on lesson 8 in your books, but we're still talking about lie number 8, which is, if it matters to my life, I should be able to control it or take effective action on it. And the practical outpouring of that lie is that we try to do what we can't do. What were some of the ways that we said that is played out? What are some of the ways that we try to do things that we can't do? Change people. And we'll talk about that one more specifically tonight, in fact. What were some other ways that we try to do things we can't? We can't save people. We talked about how there are things, last week that was kind of the specific one that we looked at, was that there are some things that only God can do. there are things that we'll just never be able to do, including saving people, bringing true, lasting peace to people, bringing healing to people. Those are things that we don't have the ability to do. God may use us, and we should be responsive to the Spirit, but we can't make that happen. Those things are only a work of God. So we looked at several of the ways that we try to do things that we can't do. Then we looked at why we do that. Sometimes we do that because we really want it. It's just a thing that we desire, and we think, I want it, so I should have it. We looked at David and Bathsheba. He saw and he took, which is really the same language is used in that story as in Genesis, when Eve saw that the fruit was appealing to the eye, and she took and she ate. David saw that it was appealing to his eye, and he took. And so we all fall into that trap. We see something, we want it, and so we try to make it happen, even though we shouldn't. We saw that sometimes we just misunderstand God's work. We think God is doing something, or we'll do it one way, and so we kind of want to just take that on ourselves and say, I'll help you out from here, God. I know what you're doing. I'll do it. And then we end up fumbling it. Abraham's story comes to mind with that. He was promised he would have a son, and when it didn't work with his wife Sarah, Sarah's idea was to take Hagar. And I think they were actually trying to be faithful to God. They knew what God's promise was. They knew how babies were made, and it wasn't happening. And so they tried to take it into their own hands and their own power. They misunderstood God's promise and his work. And then there are times where we just think we can, that if I yell loud enough, if I fight hard enough, that I'll change God's mind, that I can convince him to give me the thing that I think I want or the thing that I think I deserve. And so there are plenty of reasons why we try to do that, but we try to do things that we can't. We saw last week, again, that one of the ways that we do that is we try to do things that only God can do. Tonight, we're going to look at two different areas where we try to do things that we can't. The first is choices that only other people can make. That we try to make choices for people that are not ours to make. That only they can make them. And I think oftentimes we put our hope in being able to convince them or force them or coerce them into doing the right thing, the thing that we know is good and healthy for them. Have you ever known better than somebody else before? A couple of you have. And we know what is the right thing to do, and it's so clear and obvious to us, and so we try to impose that decision on somebody else. My guess is everybody in here has probably been on both sides of that equation. That you've tried to convince someone else to do what you knew was the right thing to do, and you've also been the hard-headed one who someone's been trying to convince you to do the right thing. And maybe in the rarest of instances, that works. Maybe, at least in the short term, it works. But more often than not, that tactic, that approach is just doomed to failure. And again, you've experienced that. You know that it doesn't work. The more that we push and direct and tell people this is what you should do, our natural response is to resist that, to double down on what we thought was the right thing to begin with. And that's not just anecdotal, like I've seen that happen, but psychologists have shown that that is our approach, that when we're faced with new information that counters something that we believe, we don't just go, oh, I have changed my mind now. I believe something different. We double down. That it actually, something happens in our brain that's like, no, that, even though it's completely contrary to what I said I believe, it now makes me believe it more. Rather than weighing out the options, maybe reconsidering, we just kind of double down. And we're not open to that. And I think today, in today's world, where we are so polarized, that, everybody's got their own set of facts or opinions or experts that they can point you to, and we see something else, and we really get like a fight or flight response, that it feels like an attack on us when someone tells us something different than what we believe. And so instead of saying, oh, let me consider that, we fight or we run away from that new information. So it's not going to work to tell people what they need to do. We can't control their options, their decisions. And we should not take that personally. It is not if someone who you have influence or relationship with does something that you know is wrong, there often is a tendency to say, well, what's wrong with me? If only I had tried harder, if only I pushed more, or maybe I pushed too much and I should have backed off, or we feel like it reflects on us. But the skill of the teacher or the mentor does not determine the results of the people who they have influence or relationship over. In your notes, Judas Iscariot is mentioned. Who was his leader? Pretty good guy, right? I don't know that anyone was a better leader than Jesus was. I'm willing to say there wasn't and hasn't been a better leader than Jesus. And yet, not all of his disciples, even the closest 12 to him, stayed true to the mission and to the message. Judas betrayed him, and we know, maybe not by name, but many others turned away from Jesus and never returned to following the way of Jesus. And Jesus was perfect, the only perfect one, and yet he wasn't able to do that. I think this especially hits home for parents, maybe not just parents, but maybe especially parents, that you know what is best for your kids, and you just want to be like, you just want to download all of that information into their brain and be like, all right, now go be my little robot. Do the things that I know that you should do. But that's not how it works. And often, the harder we push, the harder they push back against us. And we can feel like we're lacking, like there's something wrong with us because of the choices that our kids are making. But those results, who your child becomes, does not directly connect to who you are as a parent. And I think parents, we need to get that in mind, but all of us need to. We all have relationships where we have some level of influence, whether it's friendships, family relationships. Not many of you are pastors, but like, what if Pastor Mark judged himself on the way the way we all behaved? He'd probably bring up some doubts and questions in his mind from time to time, not because of you guys, but the other people who come on Sunday morning, because of the way that they behave. But you can't look at the results of those you have influence over and say, this is about me. We all have to be faithful to what God has called us to do the things that God has called us to, step into the roles that God has us, to speak when we feel like the Spirit is telling us to speak, to keep our mouth shut when the Spirit is telling us to keep our mouth shut, and to trust those results to God rather than determining who we are based off of how other people respond to us. The bottom line is that you cannot make choices for someone else. And sometimes that just stinks. But that's just the way that it is. You cannot make choices for someone else. So what are some of the things, some of the choices that we might try to make for other people? Bob?
Especially for, someone you love, you know the right thing is not to worry.
Mm.
And, I've seen it in my life where it makes the other person sick.
Mm.
And we know it's right, but they just refuse to stop worrying because,
Mm-hmm.
I'm the mother or I'm the
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking because you see a person deteriorating
Mm-hmm.
when they do that. And so that's just one.
Yeah, somebody else's, specifically you mentioned worry, but someone's emotional responses to, we can't control other people's emotional responses. We're going through the series, Do I Have to Live Stressed Out? We're talking about living in peace. I can't make any of you live peacefully. I can't make you choose peace for yourself. Even though I know that's right, even though you know that's right, we can't choose that for other people. Andy?
Anybody that's dealt with a person with an addiction,
Mm.
And trying to guide them and help them make good choices for themselves, it's a pretty powerless position to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so very practically their decisions, the things that they do or don't do, highlighted especially, I think, magnified in situations with people struggling with addiction. And that is a powerless situation where so clearly you see, well, these are the steps you should take or could take, but you can't impose that on somebody else. Anything else? things that we try to control, choices for other people where we can't do that. Yes, Bobby.
How somebody thinks of Jesus.
Mm.
We know someone that thinks of Jesus still as just a great prophet and not the Son of God.
Yeah.
And we have been trying to talk to this person, but
Yeah. Yeah.
the more you push, the more they push away.
Right.
So it's like,
Yeah, someone's perception specifically about Jesus, who Jesus is. There are, from the time Jesus was around, there have been a lot of opinions about who Jesus is. He asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah, some a prophet. And he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And it was Peter who spoke up and said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And what I think is interesting is what Jesus says to him, is that you did not get that from someone else, but the Father revealed that to you. So how do we know that Jesus is the Messiah? We weren't talked into it. The Father reveals that to us. That goes back to something we talked about last week. It's not something that we can do. We can't convince someone that. Now, God can use us, right? He can use relationships that we have with people to be that revelation. God can use his word as that revelation. But there are people who don't believe in Jesus who know the Bible better than me. So just knowing the Bible doesn't do it. Just knowing the right answers isn't what does it. The Father has to reveal that. So our perceptions of who Jesus is, we would love to be able to control that for other people, but we can't. The Father has to reveal that to others. So big, broad categories, things that people do or don't do, their attitude, their outlook. How about their opinion of you? We would love to control that, but we can't. There are things we can try to do, and many of us have run in that hamster wheel trying to get other people to think a certain way about us. And then by the time, well, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but after time, we're not even who we were when we started. We have become someone else because of all that effort to try to get them to look at us a certain way. So let's look at some of these ways specifically. One way that we try to make choices for other people is that we try to carry someone else's call or burden for them. The verses are on our side. We're going to look at Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. There, Paul says, each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. So there's kind of a message here of like personal responsibility. Whose burden is Paul telling them to carry? Their own. Each person is to carry their own burden. That we can't look and say, "Oh, they're struggling with this. I can fix this for them. I can go and do this. Oh, I'm good at that. I'll just take that for them, and maybe they can take something I'm not good at." God has given us each our own call, our own burden, our own load to carry, and that's what we are responsible for, not for other people's. But in verse 2, a little bit before this, Paul said this, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ." So what's the difference here? Because at a brief look, it can look like Paul's contradicting himself. Verse 2, he says, "Carry one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ." And then in verses 4 and 5, he's like, everybody look out for themselves and carry your own burden. So what is the relationship between these two things?
Take care of yourself first and foremost, but then support your brothers and sisters in Christ as well.
Yeah, so to look out for what God has called you to do first. That's your first responsibility. It's kind of the airplane mask message, right? Put the mask on yourself first, and then help others. But if you can't breathe, you're not going to be able to help someone else breathe for very long. So you have to take care of what God has called you to first, then help other people out. Any other thoughts about how those two messages relate? Angela?
You can support somebody without making a decision.
Mm.
You can't change. You can't make the decision, but you can support them.
Yeah.
And then I guess you still, no matter what, you have your own burdens. They have
Yeah.
I guess that's what I got.
Yeah. Difference between supporting someone and actually doing the thing for them. Michelle.
I think it's kind of the opposite, but you're still supposed to do the same thing, where maybe you're supposed to put other people first in other ways. Maybe
Mm.
not throw your burdens on people, but be willing to help others.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit more of a selfless kind of, what you can handle, and then help your brothers and sisters with their needs, especially spiritual. I think it's more spiritual.
Yeah, spiritually to be able to carry one another's burdens, to look out for one another, and I think you said to handle what you can handle and then to help other people. So knowing your limitations is part of that. What can you handle? What can't you? Well, I think we've talked about that over past few weeks, but knowing what is mine and what isn't is important. But I do think that these two do work together. I think all of what we said is a part of it, but that we are to help one another. We can support one another, kind of like a moral support, and also a tangible support from time to time. But that is different than, like Angelo said, actually doing things for people, making decisions for them. If someone has a tough choice of, maybe they got a new job offer, but they like their current job, they feel a sense of loyalty, but there's this new opportunity that looks promising, and they come to you, what should I do? You can help them carry that burden, but you can't make that choice for them. That's a choice that they have to make, but that doesn't mean that when they call you up and ask your advice, you say, I'm sorry, I'm just looking out for myself. That's on you. No, we carry the burden with them, and if they make a choice and then they come to regret it, we are still with them in that. We help them to carry that. If they make the right choice, then we celebrate with them in that. So we can carry one another's burdens, we can help and support one another, but that's not the same as doing the thing for other people. It can be addicting, and some of you may have this personality more than others, but it can be addicting to be the hero, to focus on the problems of other people and to fix them and to solve them. We can get like a little hero complex. And it does give us like short-term bursts of energy, right? And like feeling good about ourselves when we give someone advice, they listen to us, and their life is better. There's like a sense of power to that. And we can then start to be like, I've got it all together. People should listen to me more often. And then we're like butting into conversations, solving other people's problems. And we take all of that on. And even if it is short-term successes that kind of build us up and bolster us up, long-term, and maybe even medium-term, because I don't think it has to be that long, that just becomes frustrating and exhausting. You can't live like that. You can't live being the savior for everyone else. And sometimes we do that not just because it feels good, but because we want to escape our own problems. We don't know what is our purpose, what is our meaning, what is God asking me to do? And we don't know how to wrestle and engage with those questions, and so we just want to take on other people's problems because our problems seem too big. Youth group, when I was the youth pastor, and I would see this in our youth group kids a lot. Their lives would just be crazy. Like, they didn't have much together, and they had no idea what was going on. But they were great at giving. I would listen to them give other kids advice, and I'm like, why don't you do anything that you're telling them to do? Like, you're right. That is what you should do. Why are you telling them to do it? But we, not just teenagers, we all do that. It's so much easier to look at other people's problems and to see what the right thing is to do, but to turn that in on ourselves and to carry our own burden, to carry our own load that God has given us. We can't escape what God has called us to do by telling other people what we think God has called them to do, even if we're right. That's not our place. We have to carry our own first. We need to recognize the reality that we cannot choose for someone else. We can't do it. And that is a hard truth to accept, but we have to accept it. You can't choose for someone else, but you're not completely powerless. You can choose for yourself. You are responsible for the choices that you make. And so you have some control over your own decisions, your own emotions, your own opinions. And that is another way that we try to control other people, is their opinions. How do you make someone like you? How do you improve their opinion of you? I don't know how to do that. we can listen to what people want and give them what we want, but then, like I said earlier, we're no longer ourselves. We're just who we've been told we should be, rather than who God has called us to be. If all we do are the things, we could do all the things that we could think of to become someone that people would like, but then are we really even ourselves? And, spoiler alert, you'll never please everyone. There will always be people who think of you things you don't want them to think of you. There will always be people who you can work your whole life to build a reputation in one specific area, and then there will be someone who will be like, that's the thing you're the worst at. And you're like, wait, what? Like, that is who I thought I was at the core, and now I'm being told, and that can shake you deeply. But we can't live for other people's opinions, other people's responses to us. We kind of have been talking about this in our last staff meeting. We have to just be faithful to what God has called us to do. We can't look at the results of are other people listening to us or the results of what do other people think of us, that we all have a God-given call, and some of us, that call will look like success to the world. The world will be able to look at us and say, look at them, like they're really doing it. They're out there living and good things are happening. For some of us, we can be faithful to God and our lives won't look like success. People will look at us and go, what's up with them? Why can't they get their act together? Man, nothing seems to go right for them. And yet the whole time we're being faithful to what God has called us to. I think of, even in the Psalms, David says, why do the wicked prosper? When I'm the faithful one to you, and here I am distressed. Enemies surround me. And yet my enemies are seeing all the success in the world. That David was faithful, but his life at moments didn't look like that, didn't look successful. I think of the prophet Isaiah, who he is called, God kind of lays out the job description. He's like, I need someone who will go to Israel, who will tell them to turn from their ways. Oh, by the way, they will never listen. They're not going to do it, but I need someone who will be willing to go and be faithful to this call. And Isaiah's response is, here I am, send me. That the job was failure. So to be successful was to fail. No one is going to listen to this message. But God didn't look at Isaiah and say, you've failed. He looked at Isaiah and said, you've been faithful to what I've called you to do. And so it looks like a failure to everyone else, but your success is based on faithfulness. And so we have to realize that too, that we can't control other people's, the results of who they become. We can't control their opinions of us. We have to be faithful to what God has called us to do. And correcting this pattern of trying to control other people, correcting this pattern takes a rock-solid belief. That's the blank that I think you have in your notes. Correcting this pattern takes a rock-solid belief that God does not ask us to do what we cannot do. We have to believe that there are things that we can't do, and we have to trust God to be in charge of those, that we won't be judged on the things that we never could have done. So it takes that belief, that faith, that trust in who God is, but I also think it takes a security in who God has made us to be. If you have Bibles, you can turn with me to John 5. This one isn't on the side of your notes. But as I was thinking through this, I thought about Jesus, who there were, as I said, there were a lot of people who had a lot of different opinions about who Jesus was. And he didn't let that determine what he did or didn't do. There are a lot of people who wanted things from Jesus, and he would walk away. They wanted to crown him king, and it says he just walked through, or he disappeared through the midst of them. He just kind of walked through the crowd. He rejected that. There were times where crowds would come wanting to be healed, and Jesus would say, well, we have to go to another town. And so Jesus made decisions that frustrated the crowds all the time. And in John chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, Jesus gave them this answer. Very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you will all be amazed. But that idea that Jesus could do nothing other than what he saw the Father doing. we get so wrapped up in other people's stories. What are they doing? How can I fix that? What do they think about me? If I do this, what will people say? We're worried about the stories other people tell themselves about us. Jesus was only concerned with one story, the story that the Father was telling. And so he walked faithfully in that story. We have to be consumed like Jesus was with that story. Not what do other people expect of me, what do other people want of me, but what is the story that God is telling and asking me to be a part of? And how can I be a part of that? And then act faithfully in that. So we need belief in what God has asked us to do, a trust that he won't ask us to do more than we can, and a security in who God made us to be. So in addition to making choices for other people, we often try to change the bad to good. And again, both of these, most of the things that we're looking at, most of the lies that we're looking at through this entire study come from a good-hearted place, a well-intentioned place. Some of us do good for others out of selfish ambition, but we see someone who's struggling and we want to make it good. We see someone heading down the wrong path and we want to tell them, don't do that, go this way. And so changing something from bad to good is obviously a good thing to do. But only God can do that. God is ultimately the one who redeems. Bad stuff comes into our lives, and there's nothing that we can do about that. Is there anyone here who has never had a bad experience? I didn't think so. I had a feeling that we have all been through something bad. We can't change that. That we all encounter suffering, that we all encounter sorrow. Sometimes it happens frequently, far more frequently than we would want it to. Sometimes it comes in waves. Sometimes we do get seasons of reprieve, but at some point we all encounter something bad, something sorrowful. If you could stop bad from coming into your life, would you? I think at some level, the answer is yes, right? We would. We're in a church here, so we know the church answer is well, God, but we're no, I would like for no bad things to happen to me. If you did, say you were granted the ability to get rid of all the bad things, don't you think that would solve a lot of your problems, make your life easier, filled with more joy and peace? You'd never learn anything. You would never grow. I hear you, but part of me is yes, it would be a lot more joyful and peaceful, right? But it's in tough situations, it's through stress, through grief, through sorrow that we learn, that we grow. And some of that, we can play that game, and we've probably played that game in our mind. God, why are you doing this? If you got this out of my life, not just I would be happy, but I could live for you. I could be happier. I could be more joyful and peaceful. People would look at me and I could be this is because of God. So get rid of this bad stuff so that I can be a witness for you. So why doesn't God stop the bad things? I think we mentioned some of those reasons already. But if we would, right, if we could, we would stop the bad from entering our lives. There is a temptation to think we would be more peaceful and more joyful. So why doesn't God do that?
Well, in addition to what the Bible verse refers to here, because he's working in us and through us.
Right.
I think on the other hand also, it keeps us humble.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a humility. Yeah. Yeah, so it keeps us humble. You mentioned Paul, the thorn in his flesh that he asked 3 times for God to remove, and for whatever reason, that is not what happened. But Paul touches on a spiritual truth that is so contradictory to the way we think and the way we live in this world. He says, in my weakness, your strength is made full. We think, let me be as strong as possible, God, and then I'll do whatever you want. But Paul says, when I am weak, you are strong. You're able to get the glory. You're able to shine through me. That weakness is the advantageous position rather than in strength. Michelle?
That basically touches on what I was going to say, is I think God is glorified more in how we handle the hard things and our example to other people, because that gives other people hope and something to see when they're having hard times.
Hmm.
If any, we're not relatable if things are happy and good all the time. People are going to say to you, yeah, but your life is perfect.
Hmm.
So what, so I think going through hard times is part of our ministry and our testimony to serve for his glory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Our hardships are a way that God redeems other people's hardships. That when we go through difficult times, and we're never going to do that totally perfectly, but when we can make it through difficult times and we can still have a hope and a joy in the Lord, that is a testimony in and of itself to the world. That how can you go through these things and still have a hope? Rather than if you got saved and everything was perfectly fine, that isn't of course you would do that. Like there's no commitment there. You're just here. It's what Satan, what the adversary said to God about Job. He's just in it for the stuff that you give him. Look at his life. Who wouldn't follow you if they got all the stuff that Job got? And so people, if that was what being Christian was, people would be like, well, of course you think that. Look at all the stuff you get. But we face trials just like everybody else. And when we can go through that with a hope, then that catches the world's attention. I know people in my life who have gone through things, and to watch them, the way that they go through it, certainly I don't have the whole picture, but to see them resolute, and this is who God is still good even in the midst of this, it is a testimony to me. And so why does God do this? I think we've touched on several of the reasons. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 are on the side there. And there, James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature, complete, not lacking anything." So when we face trials, we are supposed to count it as what? Joy. Why? Yes, you know the benefit you're going to get from it, right? I have mentioned before in December, my family, we went through COVID, and before that, Lee and I got in a decent routine of like getting up together in the morning and doing a little workout, and then that happened, and we got out of it. Until this week, I am so sore. And I just want to be like, no, I'm done. Like, well, I'm not. But why do people put themselves through that? Because they know the benefit, what it will produce in them. So what does James say that trials will produce in us? Maturity. Perseverance. That we will not lack anything, that we will be complete. God uses the trials in our lives, as we've mentioned, to produce something, to give us an education so that we can grow, so that we can learn, so that we can help other people, so that we can be mature, complete, not lacking anything. That there is a process that God is doing in us, that suffering, trials of many kinds, is how we get there. Could there be another way? Maybe. Is there another way? No. That this is the way it works. This is how God works in and through us. Next month, in the Bible reading plan for year 2, we're going through Genesis, and I've started looking at Genesis. And when God, the creation story, Genesis 1, God creates, and so each day there was night and morning each day. So the day begins at night. So it begins at sunset, and the new day begins at sunset, which it's been in the Bible for a while, so I don't expect that to be news to you. But it is a little counterintuitive. We think we know it starts at midnight, but we think the day starts when the sun rises, that's the new day. And I was reading a commentary, and they just were saying how this is true in our own lives as well, that every new thing that God is doing in us starts with a period of darkness first. That God doesn't shine a light and say, this is the thing that I want for you. He says, step into the darkness. A new day has started. Step into it. I have new things for you. Abraham is called to leave his family and go to a land I will show you. How do you even start to obey that? Which direction should I go? I don't even know where to start. And yet he did. But there was a darkness of go where I'll show you, but just go. Okay, here's a step into the darkness, but then a light comes. Think of Moses. We've been going through his story, and we think of him as leading the Israelites through the wilderness and out of Egypt, but for 40 years he was in the wilderness. That there was a period of darkness where Moses was a has-been. He was done. He was washed up. God had no use for him. He was shepherding his father-in-law's fields. That was what he was going to do. But God used that period of darkness and then shone a light in a burning bush and said, I've got new plans for you. And go back to Egypt. That was probably a dark time. Go back to this place where you have run away from, and I have something for you. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they were thrown into the fiery furnace. They weren't told what was going to happen. In fact, their response to King Nebuchadnezzar is, our God can save us. He will save us. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to you. We won't worship you. And I think that's the faith that we have, that God can save us from this. God is going to save us from this. But even if he doesn't, I'm going to worship him. I'm going to trust that these trials are worth it. I'm going to count it as joy. And that word count is it's an accounting term. To count, to reconcile, to add it all up, and what does it come out in the red or in the black? Our trials come out in the black, that we are positive because of those trials that happen to us. We are mature. We are not lacking anything. We see this, I mentioned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but we see this in Daniel's story as well. In Daniel chapter 6, we'll read Daniel 6, verses 13 through 22. Then, excuse me. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. So a story that is probably familiar to most of us, Daniel in the lion's den. What Daniel very much finds himself in a predicament, but what was the crux of the problem for Darius? What? Right. Siri wanted to be a part of Bible study. Yes, Darius was kind of duped by earlier, we didn't read it, but was duped by these, does it say who these guys are. Yeah, they were like priests. They were kind of his servants, his right-hand men, that they don't like Daniel because everything Daniel touches turns to gold, not literally, but everything is going right for Daniel. And so they are jealous of Daniel. And they're like, what can we do? Well, he prays only to Yahweh, and maybe we can talk the king into getting him to write a law where you can only pray to King Darius. And so Darius hears that, and he's like, yeah, that's awesome. Let's do that. So he makes it a law, and then the guys come, and they're like, hey, Daniel, your buddy, the guy you like, he's not praying to you. He's praying to Yahweh several times a day. We've seen him. And so Darius is like, I like Daniel. This was not what I was planning to do. So he follows through in his word, and he puts Daniel into the den. And how does he deal with this? High anxiety, right? He's stressed. He can't sleep. There's no entertainment. He doesn't even watch Netflix to fall asleep. Nothing's working. It's not happening. And so he is up all night. Now, how about Daniel? Daniel, also in a bit of a predicament, right? Probably not a place where you want to spend the night with a bunch of lions. Did God keep him from the bad? Well, sort of is, yeah. Let's say no, right? He was literally thrown into the bad. God protected him from death, from physical harm, but when did Daniel know that was going to happen? And I wonder if Daniel slept. Did he eventually have a trust in God that all right, I'm just going to fall asleep over here? Or was he looking at the lions all night just in case God let one of them attack him? I don't know how it worked out. But God did not completely remove him from the situation. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Were they spared the bad? No, they got thrown into the fiery furnace. But God saved him through the bad. Those, I think, are the blanks that you have. So God didn't spare Daniel the bad. God saves him through the bad. Can anybody relate to that? Does that sound like anybody's life here? God hasn't spared the bad from you, but God has saved you through it. And some of you are here in the midst of the bad, and you're wondering, will God save me through it? You have some brothers and sisters here who can testify that yes, he will save you through it. We have testimony in God's word that God will save you through it. That God won't spare you all of the bad, but when you go through it, God goes through it with you. I think we try to have a positive outlook on life, right? Good vibes only. We want only the power of positive thinking. We want to have a positive outlook on life. And when bad things happen, we encourage ourselves and others to try to find the good in the bad. And again, a well-meaning intention. But I think that only God can actually take the bad and turn it into good. And I think that when we try to live with that positive mindset of, let me look for the good in the bad. Let me see if I can try to find what is actually good about this. We're looking. We're not trusting. And as people of God, we walk by faith, not by sight. And so if I'm looking into my bad situation saying, can I find the good? If I can find the good, then I'll trust God. If I can figure it out, if I can play this scenario out in my mind about how eventually this will be good for me, then, okay, God, you can have this one. That's not faith, right? If we only accept the bad when we can see the good, we don't have faith. We're trusting our ability to determine the outcome rather than saying, all right, God, here's the lion's den. I'm going in. Here's the fiery furnace. I know what the right thing to do is. I guess I'm going in. Rather than, is God going to save me from this? If he does, I'll go in. But if not, then maybe not. That's not faith. We have to walk by faith and not by sight. The story of Joseph in Genesis, we're not going to read all the chapters of Genesis 37 to 50, but God uses Joseph and his story to kind of show that God's not going to let you escape the bad, but God will use it. What are some of the bad things that happened to Joseph, if you remember his story? He was thrown into a pit, which was almost one of the better things that happened to him, because the other option was, we're going to kill you. But yeah, he got thrown into a pit. Yeah, sold into slavery. And I don't think that's ever a good thing to have happen to you, but your brothers are the one who did it. That there's an added dose of betrayal to this, that your brothers are the ones who schemed up this plan. Any other bad things that happened to Joseph? Yeah, he was accused of trying to force himself on Potiphar's wife when it was the exact opposite scenario in his life. Thrown into prison because of that. In prison, he interprets some dreams, and the guy who doesn't die after that is like, I'm going to remember you, and then forgets him for years. And so plenty of bad things happened to Joseph. And as you read through the Joseph narrative, several times, at least two immediately come to mind. In the pit, it says that God was with Joseph. And then when he was in prison, when the cupbearer forgot him, it says God was with Joseph. If I'm Joseph, I'm like, God, maybe you can leave too, because this isn't going well for me right now. But God didn't save him from the bad. He saved him through it. God was with him in those times. Ultimately, each bad thing brought Joseph closer to what? What's the end of that story? Leadership? Yeah, he had a prominent role of leadership, and with that prominent role, he did what? Saved a lot of people, not least of which his brothers who sold him into slavery. That the end of that story, towards the end of that story, Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God meant for good. And that is really, it's at the end, but that's the theme of Genesis. That what we humans intend for evil, God will use for good. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to the world lately, people still intend things for evil. But God is still working. God is not, he's not behind on the scoreboard. He's not trying to catch up. God is still using our evil intentions for his good. God is still at work. You've experienced it. I've heard it. I've experienced it. We're going to have a baptism service in a couple weeks where we're going to hear that God is very much at work, that there are evil intentions all around us, but God is using those for good. If Joseph had just run away, if he had just quit, if he had tried to escape from his slave traders, if he had run away from Potiphar, if he had tried to escape from prison, his story would have looked vastly different. The story of the Bible would have to look vastly different because God's chosen people would have died in a famine. And so it was Joseph's faithfulness to where God had him, Joseph's faithfulness and his ability to walk by faith and not by sight, that it is almost laughable in my cynical nature to read, and God was with Joseph. It's like, really? Were you? But Joseph says, God is with me. In the pit, he knew God was with me. In prison, he knew God was with him. And so he was able to walk by faith and not by sight. We have to be able to do the same thing. We have to get out of the escape mentality and return to trusting God's plan for us in good or bad. We have to get rid of that, how can I get out of these problems? How can I avoid this bad, uncomfortable situation? And instead, how can I trust God in and through this situation? That faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. God can take me out of this. God will take me out of this. But even if he doesn't, I'm going to be faithful through this situation. That's all I've got for you tonight. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Michelle.
I think it makes it easier to remember that throughout the whole Bible we have examples of everyone that God chooses or anoints is initially rejected.
Mm.
And it's not us. There's in 1 Samuel, I think, when Saul is chosen and he's going
Yeah, I think that's great. We have to be rooted in our call that God has for us. Our call is to be faithful to what he has called us to, not to get people to accept. We don't have to convince people this is what God has called me to. We just have to be faithful to what God has called us to. Bob.
Yeah, like Michelle said, there's plenty of examples in the Bible, but I think most of us could look back in our own lives and use the dark times to see how he was with us then, and he pulled us out of that,
Mm-hmm.
and made us more mature and more trusting and faithful.
Yep.
For me, it's just, I just praise him every day for the dark times, because I grew so much through it.
Yeah.
So again, when, there'll be more, never ending till we're with him. So we could always use them examples.
Yeah.
Ask how he's worked in our
Yep.
lives.
Yeah, our own experiences become like an altar to God's faithfulness, right? We read through the Old Testament, and they're always making altars. They cross the Red Sea, they build an altar to remind themselves of what God did. And so our own experiences, when we go through dark times and we're on the other side, we see how God has used that. We can, if you want to physically do it. But at least mentally, we can build an altar that reminds us of God's faithfulness, so that when we get to the next Red Sea, when we get to the next dark moment, we know God was faithful then, God will be faithful now. Tara.
I think we go through bad things because if everything was good all the time, we'd be joyful and then content and then bored, and then everything would just be like everything's great, and it would lead us away from God more because it would be like, oh, I've got this, I don't need you.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, I think that human nature, we would pull away from God instead of going to Him when we're in times.
Yeah. I'm about to butcher a C.S. Lewis quote, but you can Google the actual quote later if you want. But he says in his book, The Problem of Pain, he says something like, God whispers to us in our joys, but he shouts to us in our pain. That we can look at the beauty that God has made, and in good times we can be reminded of how good God is. But it's when we are in the dark times that we're reminded, I need to be back at the foot of the throne of God. That drives us back. To me, that's such a powerful testimony of the book of Psalms, that David, when he's going through hard times, he doesn't allow that to create distance between him and God. He brings it to God and says, God, what is going on? Where are you with this? When are you going to show up? I've been crying out for days, for weeks. My couch is flooded in tears. Where are you? And so I think when we go through those dark times, don't allow that to create distance between you and God. But that doesn't mean you have to pretend everything's fine either. You don't have to, in the midst of the dark times, say, thank you, God, for this. You can say, God, where are you in this? Bring that to him. And I think if couples who are here, you've probably had fights, one or two of them, and eventually they bring you closer. Because if you pretend like everything's fine, then eventually everything blows up. But if where have you been? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Like having it out, this is what's wrong. Eventually that builds, it can build, done wrongly, poorly, selfishly, and abusively. It can create distance and should create distance. But a healthy fight actually builds strength in a relationship. And I think that happens with us and God too. God isn't asking us to pretend like we enjoy everything. We can come to him and say, I don't like this. What the heck is going on? And I think that will strengthen our relationship with him. Angela.
When you talk a lot, the word times, good, bad times, hard times, I think oftentimes the length of time or our perception of time. When things are bad, but then they just don't go away, and then I think that people start questioning their faith during that. And so I guess the point I don't know what I was trying to say as more is that our time is in God's time.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can kind of let him or allow him to show in his time, then we can really grow from that or learn from it, rather than if we're just trying to push our time.
Yeah. Yeah, we feel it, obviously, in time. We feel it right now. But our life is but a vapor. And so the suffering that we're experiencing, I don't want to minimize the hard things that we go through. They are intense and painful. And like you, I'd vote them out if God gave me veto power. But really, we're here for eternity. So in the grand scheme of things, they're but a blip on the radar. And as Bob mentioned, and I'm sure you've experienced, the bad things that you have gone through, think back. Can you start to see how God has used those for good? Now, there are probably some things that you're like, I don't know how God's going to use this for good. You might still be wondering. But take what you know about how God has used some of the bad that you've been through for his good. Now, multiply that by eternity. That with enough time, we will see how God has used all the bad, the things that we can't explain, the most horrific things that have happened to us that we wouldn't wish upon anyone else, that we don't want to go through. We'll be able to see how God has used that to bring us ultimate joy, to build perseverance, to bring us to maturity so that we lack nothing. I understand that that's hard to hold on to in the midst of the fire. But if we can remember that, all right, I've started to see how God has used some of the bad in the past, I'm going to trust him that given eternity, even this will start to make some sense. Any other thoughts? Yes, Janet.
I believe it's the David Koch series called Lamenting is Worship. It was just so powerful for me because it laid out the concept of you can cry out to God, you can say, where are you? Don't you know how much I hurt? But they always end with, nevertheless, God, you are in control. And I think they're so applicable to anything we're going through.
Yeah.
That we can be honest with our emotions.
Yeah, I love that.
Trust that God's still on the throne.
Yeah, I love that. Lamenting is worship. That we can lament and we can end with, but you're on your throne, just like David did in the Psalms. Next week, we'll finish up talking about things that we try to do that we can't by talking about how we fight for fair. So some of you who want everything to be fair, make sure you're here next week because life's not fair, okay? Let's close with prayer and then we'll go. Lord, we are grateful that you are a good God, that you will not be outdone by the evil intentions of man, but that the things that we as humans desire for evil, you will use those for good. God, would you help us to be rooted in the soil of faith, of trust, that that is who you are, that that is what you're doing, that we would be able to, as James said, to count it joy when we face trials. Would you help us to have an eternal mindset, to see that what is happening now is not what will be happening forever? Would you tune our spirits to yours so that we can be a part of the promise that we have, that you will turn all things to good for those who are called according to your purpose? Would you help us to see how your Spirit is moving and to work alongside what you're doing so that we can be some of those agents of turning bad to good? But Lord, help us not to spin our wheels trying to do the things that we know we can't do. We're surrounded by people who make decisions that we disagree with, decisions that we know are wrong. We're surrounded by people who have opinions of us that we would love to change and convince them that they're wrong. But these are things that we can't do. What you have asked us to do is to be faithful to your call in our lives. And so, Lord, I pray that we would be a people who can walk by faith and not by sight, who can trust that we are who you say we are, not who those around us say. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.